Hey, Maddie, what are we going to be talking about today?
Michelle, we're talking about feeders, specifically the high school college pipeline. We're going to go over how different high schools in America provide different odds of being accepted to top universities. We're going to use my favorite website to check out how it works. You ready?
Ooh, yes, I'm ready. I have been interested in this for so long, so can't wait to hear more about it.
Let's do it. Okay. Michelle, where did your son Jonathan go to high school?
So he went to Catalina Foothills High School in Tucson.
So I have a magic website here called PolarisList.com. It's PolarisList.com. And I will get into more depth. But did you know, Michelle, between the years of 2015 and 2020, your son's high school sent 3 kids to Harvard, 1 to Princeton, and 2 to MIT?
I did know about the Harvard one because we know like all 3 of those Harvard kids. Yes.
And what that means is a little bit complicated, but that's what we're going to get to today. Michelle, your son will end up at NYU, and I don't know if it was terribly related to his high school, but it didn't hurt. I believe that probably the most, if not the most important, probably the most underrated aspect of whom does and doesn't get into top universities or universities in general is the high school they go to. And that's because schools work in a very specific way. Why, right? So the big question is, why would it matter? For those who don't know, like a feeder is a colloquial term for a high school that feeds into universities. And that includes Harvard, Stanford, Yale, but also goes to, all the Ivies, other top schools. And even it can also apply to more local schools. So California schools feed into the UC system. Schools in Texas will feed into UT Austin. And so it goes further down the line, but it's generally mostly considered when it comes to elite universities that are most difficult to get into, which is kind of what we specialize in. And well, the first question is, why would they care? Like why, if a university is just looking for the best students or the best class or what have you, why would they have this incentive to pick and choose from certain high schools? It seems a little bit silly. And I have 3 major reasons. The first, and this is the biggest, is the need for structure. And I think college application process is actually very impressive how they handle it, especially when we talk about the early rounds, bringing in a lot of different, tens of thousands of applications. They're churning through them at these 5% acceptance rate schools. And how do they do that with like all the criteria? And they do give some amount of time to every student read the essays, how do you get there? And these schools are essentially like giant industries, and they need structure in which they do it. And you could think about the chaos that would ensue if a school basically just took, like Harvard just took like 80,000 applications and then just tried to find 2,000 people of them. Like,
Right.
I imagine like a giant pile, like it's just like, oh shit, it's picking it off as this big pile of things. They can't do that. That's not feasible, certainly in the time frame that these schools have to actually get this done. So instead, they have structure system. And how else do you naturally and logically structure the students you are having apply except by where they went to high school? That is the most logical way to kind of sort different students into slots that make sense. That, I guess, that as a part of location, like the state they come from is another one. And schools will openly talk about that. They care about the state you come from usually. But the actual high schools is a way within those states to kind of break down where these kids are actually coming from. And we'll get into how they do it via the whole feeder system. But that, I do believe, is the ultimate reason that where your high school is so important, because you are being slotted into a pre-built factory of acceptance that these schools need to do to be able to get it done in time.
It's like a known quantity, these feeder schools.
Yeah, and I think when I'm talking about like how feeders work, we'll get into the different types of them. It might make more sense how the structure is set up, but that I do believe like that is by far the biggest reason is to not just save them time, but to make it possible to get all these applications churned through and to have a full class in the 6 weeks for early round, 2.5, 3 months for regular decision that they have to go through. The second, and this is particularly why feeder students are popular, is they are pre-vetted. So at some point we might do an episode about lying on a college application, because it's not that you should, children. It's not good, and my students don't lie.
No, never.
But probably one of the little worst kept secrets of this process is how little fact checking and vetting these schools have for students, especially at the top level. And they do try, and occasionally they can check it out. So I've had students that admissions people at top schools were kind of, calling people and asking questions. Like it does happen, but it's pretty rare. And a lot of times they're kind of taking you at your word because they don't have the time, they don't have the resources. Just like they don't have the resources to check in all this different stuff. So one of the best what they schools really like to do is pre-vet students, and that's pre-vet. Basically have markers on their application that implies that what they're saying is genuine or that they are going to be a successful student in the first place. And the easiest way to probably pre-vet a student is to have them come from an elite high school that typically has well-established, well-educated students that tend to succeed at that university. It's not a perfect system, but I understand why that's what they go with. Like it's almost a trust system that students from certain schools have been successful in the past, and you know why. You know the people who work there. You have those connections. Although that also isn't on this list. Like I don't really think it's like they like them that much. Like they're buddy with the admissions team. Like that's probably going to be like a 4-3. Like I know like Daddy doesn't make a phone call in 2024. Like, that's not one of the
Right.
reasons, I don't think. Like, it's not the 80s anymore. But they are pre-vetted, and you know who they're coming from. And maybe if there's a problem, you know who to get mad at. Like, that doesn't hurt either. Um, and then the third one, oh, here we go. Here we go. Hold on. It's been a couple episodes. Okay.
Uh-oh, uh-oh. Here comes
Ready?
the
The hat's
hat.
come back. Hat's come back. Hat's come back. This is my Just Trust Me Bro hat for those joining in here, episode 11. And okay, so hear me out. These schools are need blind, right?
Mhm.
And I do believe they mostly are. However, need blind is kind of need blind, of course, meaning that they do not look at the financial need offers of students before choosing to accept them or not. However, these schools still have budgets to balance, and money still very much matters. So how do you do that if you don't even know who really you're accepting? Well, if instead of say only accepting 60-70% of students who can pay full ticket value, you instead take 60% of students from high schools that themselves cost $60,000 a year to go to, well, it turns out that most students who can afford to go to the most elite high schools in America can also afford full sticker price for a Harvard or a Stanford or a Yale, and that is how you clean your books nice and easy, and that's coming off. So that's the third reason.
That makes sense.
Can't prove that one. It makes sense. Sure makes sense to
Yep.
me. It's a nice little workaround. Okay, so that's why I believe schools do care where you go to high school, and it matters to them. So that leads us to probably my favorite website in all of college admissions, which is this Polaris List. And I'm going to go over it. Basically, there's an absolute wizard madman or mad lass, I don't know, who between the years of 2015 and 2020, all I can say is essentially exploit a loophole or a mistake that specifically Harvard, Princeton, and MIT made. And I'm not sure what that mistake is exactly. My guess is that these schools for these 5 years were putting out some sort of promotional list, like on their social media feed, where it's like, check out all the high schools that our students are coming from. That is my best guess, like doing my research. And I think I found one such list from like 2019 from like Harvard posted it. Because what this man or woman did essentially reverse engineered these lists to build a website that provides data that upfront may not seem that relevant, but it turns out is extremely relevant. Where essentially this website lists how many students from every high school in America that was tracked got into Harvard, Princeton, and MIT between the years of 2015 and 2020. And we're looking at the website right here. Big number one is Stuyvesant High School in New York. So between these, you can also track by year, but it gets kind of messy. It's like by years. I'll just be using the full data, which is about a 6-year period for this episode. And you can see here 56, 49, 50. And why is that so important? I guess we might get to when I spend the next 20 minutes talking at depth about like how awesome this data is. But the short version is that this website essentially is crack the code, if you will. It's my what is it? It's all 26 it's a stone. But isn't it like you convert something? It's all 26 letters. Oh, it's gonna drive you insane. It's something stone. It's my conversion chart to essentially quick and easy know the feederdom level of every high school in America. It has been incredibly accurate in my opinion and been incredibly helpful. It also makes me look like a wizard on consultations because I bust this thing out every single time.
So when you met us, you could put in his high school and be like, "Yeah, you're not a feeder."
We'll get to it. You're like a mini feeder, yeah. And it's I guess there are some weaknesses of the website. So, A, it's the data only go to 2020. This website, I found it. I don't know how I found it. I think it was a link on a website or whatever, or on an internet, just a forum. But this website basically completely stopped updating in 2020. My guess is they closed the exploit, whatever it was. Also, it's only Harvard, Princeton, and MIT, which can lead to some somewhat wonky results, I suppose, the further we go down, because we'll get to, there's a lot of variance. However, the nature of feederdom is it kind of rolls downhill. So don't worry if you're not, if you're trying to apply to Harvard, Princeton, or MIT, that's great. This data is very helpful. If you're trying to apply to Cornell or Stanford, or really any top 20 school, I found that there's a strong correlation with the feeder dumb, if you will, the value, like feeder value of a high school as it relates to pretty much any top university. Probably the only difference is if you're in California, you're gonna have to do your own little mental math on UCLA and Berkeley, but I think that correlates somewhat strongly as well. And you are obviously probably going to get advantages on any school that is in your state. That one is a little bit more iffy, but if you live in Pennsylvania, I do believe you get a good edge at University of Pennsylvania. If you live in wherever Yale is, you get it's my that's the idea. So you have to trust, and also it's my fact it's technically outdated. I will find that theater doesn't change very much. That's important. Like, part of the vetting strategy is there's a very stable connection made with these schools. So this data, I think, is 95% as valuable as it was in 2020, and in 15 years it will be 80% as valuable. This process just does not move that quickly. Okay, so now we're on the website, and I've kind of broken it in. They're ranked, basically it's all yours, and I've basically broken it into, I believe it's 4 different categories. Yeah, 4 different categories of feederdom, as I keep calling it. And here at the top, which I include schools 1 through 100, roughly 1 through 100. And feel free to play at home if there's a search bar. And if you're not going to this website putting your high school in, I don't know what to, I do it on dates with people. Like, it's one of my hobbies. It's like it's like an astrological sign when I meet people. Like, where'd you go to high school? I want to show you something. Um, so down to 1 to 100, and you could see here, you could basically divide the numbers by 5 or 6, and that will kind of explain how many students are around, how many students are getting accepted a year. So at the top, at 155, which is nuts, you're getting about 30 students a year into these 3 schools. Here, around 100, you are getting more like, I guess it's about 1 student each, and that's kind of where I put the bar at capital F feeder, is that every single year, roughly 1 student's getting into Harvard, 1 student's getting into MIT, and 1 student's getting into Princeton here. And I guess I can continue. Let me move my window a little bit. I guess I can keep scrolling around here. We can start at the top, actually. So this this website, feeders are real. Is like, that's probably the number one takeaway. I can make it very obvious. And if you do any amount of digging, either objective or subjective, this process, you will find the same thing, that this process is real. There's no half for this one. Like, it absolutely matters where you go to high school. I found that the feeders in this level. Well, first I want to show you my favorite school in a high school in the country, which is Princeton High School, and this is the one I use. I didn't know Princeton. And just a note, I live in the Bay Area. I don't know a ton about these schools in particular. Like, that's why this website is so Rosetta Stone. I got it. Like the span, like how I failed to learn Spanish that one time. I don't take this as I know that much about any of these schools, because I don't. I know a good amount about, like, Bay Area schools, and some of these because I've worked with, like, elite students. But I'm mostly talking just what the data has shown me and what I'm projecting from it. But let's talk about Princeton gosh darn high school. Michelle, between the years of 2015 and 2020, 94 students from Princeton were accepted, Princeton High School were accepted into Princeton University.
That is insane. Wow.
And I dare you to write me or make a comment that explains that no, feeders aren't real. That Princeton High School sends, what is this, about 18 to 20 students a year to Princeton. Like, Lawrenceville does well for itself, but Cedar Hat Phillips goes to Harvard. Boston Latin, another one, Boston Latin, 116 to Harvard, 3 to Princeton, 8 to MIT. And that's something about feeders, is that it's not perfect. And there's one thing I wish this website had, it would just be more schools. I wish it had Cornell. I wish it had, honestly, like Yale and Penn and Brown might not be as helpful, but like a little bit further down. I wish I had Cornell. I wish I had USC. I wish it had like that second tier because that does behave a little bit differently. And I think I would better understand how those schools operate with that data. But in general, if kids are getting into these three, like they're getting in everywhere, Thomas Jefferson, but just the volume of students is what kind of blows you away at the very top here. That we're talking, isn't it just an insane amount? And you got to break this website down and like these feeders into. I guess we have three. We have three subgroups. The first includes Phillips Exeter, Phillips, and I'm sure multiple other schools on this chart. Those are just two I'm most familiar with, and these are essentially like hive minds. They are the most elite high schools in America, and I've worked with students at these schools. They often also are being accepted in programs like RSI or other elite summer programs. They themselves are extremely exclusive to be accepted to, and the students I do believe your average student at like a Phillips Exeter is probably of higher, I guess, aptitude or like academic potential than a student at a Harvard or an MIT because it's harder to get into and it's like a smaller subgroup. Yeah, so that's kind of your first subgroup, and I apologize. I guarantee there are other schools. I don't know exactly which ones. I just know these are the ones that I have. The other is definitely my boys over at Princeton High School, and if you look, these are mostly East Coast. It's like East Coast, extreme East Coast. Although the side effect is also California version here. It's like Harvard Westlake. We'll get to that. But your average East Coast prep school, I guess those are the ones that you can note like the day tuition, which is 62,000, 49,000.
Yeah, I was looking at that too.
Yeah, I've never actually quite made that connection, but I think that's probably the best way to make the distinction is if there is a boarding tuition. On the Phillips side, yeah, I don't know. But Michelle, this is one of my favorite bits. I've ever told you about $50,000 preschool.
Oh my gosh, no. That sounds insane though.
Okay, so there are legends. There are legends on the East Coast, not only California. The legends on the East Coast of well, not 50, but like 30, 40, probably 50, no, 30, $40,000 preschool. And you have these insane New York moms desperate to get their little baby into this unbelievably expensive, I'm sure very nice preschool. And it on its face seems completely insane, like haha, New York people. But the workings of it are more insidious than that, in that $40,000 preschool is the only real way to get into the $45,000 kindergarten / elementary school, which itself is the only way into the $50,000 middle school, which itself is the only way into Princeton High School, which sends 94 students every 5 years to Princeton.
Yep. Like the feeder into the feeder into the feeder.
Yes,
Wow.
yeah, that's how
Okay.
deep this game goes, and stuff like this is why, like, I love this world because it's so goddamn insane, but, like, stories like and you start finding those we're not the only ones that are, like families are desperate to get into these top schools, and, like, that's why we're able to run this company, and that's why hopefully people are enjoying our free podcast and everything, but, there this process goes that deep, that to the point where I do believe there are other consultants that work for, like, getting your little darling into Princeton, or I mean, into, like, Princeton
Oh my
kindergarten,
gosh.
yeah, Princeton
Preschool
pre, like, a
admissions.
preschool. It's could you imagine little tigers everywhere, the emblems? Yeah, it's Princeton pre. But yeah, that's basically your capital F years, and I guess I don't work with too many students from these, if only because they're pretty exclusive. There's only so many students who go to these top schools. I suspect this is theory crafting. I have had a couple, but I suspect that I don't because they definitely get consultants as well, and they do well. And when they do, I get excited. I go, "Ooh, you go to a feeder!" So usually what I start our consultation with. I suspect that often part of going to schools is they're often very affluent, very linked, connected, and they often have very good admissions teams on their own. That doesn't mean they're not getting outside help. It's very possible they still are, but I also believe this is probably where like the big boys, if you will, like the big time consulting firms that really connect, like play with the top level, they have their hooks in these schools in particular. And I would love to, if you go to a feeder, hit me up, bro. I will absolutely help you get into Princeton. If you go to Princeton High, like hit me up. Like we are applying restricted early action. And yeah, it's winware. Oh, and I guess there's also a third version. I'm scrolling through it is essentially just elite Bay Area and Los Angeles schools as well, like very expensive procedures. These ones are a little bit different. These I don't believe you pay for the high school. This one's a different rant that essentially in the Bay Area, it's done a bit different. The zoning laws in California is how I best understand it. And there are very affluent areas of Northern California, where I live, in Los Angeles. And the way school zoning works is you have kind of these rings of very affluent, like kind of mansions in places like Cupertino, San Francisco. I live in Alameda. It's nice, not as nice. But yeah, like, Palo Alto, where I used to live. And in the middle of those giant rings, which pay all the property taxes into the schooling, you have these very specific high schools. That's kind of the California version of like this game is deeper than you could ever imagine of how kind of that's also why if you're wondering why Northern California and LA has like pockets of like the nicest places in the world, and then just kind of weird like sewer systems of much less areas throughout it because they're outside the bubbles. I was wondering, like that's another story. Um, yeah, I suppose it takes you places. Okay, so that now takes me to kind of 100 through 400, which I just like lowercase f feeders. And these are the schools that are sending, I imagine, about like zero point 0.5 to 1 student a year to these top schools. But you're seeing here that they're still getting their numbers. Essentially, I guess I could talk about like how the feeder system actually works. A capital F feeder, I do believe it is very much blocked out. Like, also, all this will depend on the university itself. It's always going to be different. And I'm probably oversimplifying some stuff. But with the capital F feeder, I imagine that they really do block out something like, well, we take 8 students a year from Phillips Exeter. We take 6. And I don't know if it's that clean cut, but I think it's pretty close because that's something you'll also find if you go and play with the year structure. You can see how consistent it is. That from one year, like between 2015 and 2017, Phillips Exeter gets, I don't know, like 55 kids in. Well, from 2019 and 2020, the same 2-year period, they get 57 kids into these 3 schools. Like there is a consistency. Princeton High School is still sending kids to Princeton at the same rate.
Yes, so they, like, have these spots, like, carved out every year.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's consistent in a way that and it makes sense given the whole
Mhm.
structural argument is that you know how many students you're going to let you want to accept, and it's much easier. Like we take 8 kids from this high school every year, 6 from this high school every year, 3 or 4 from this high school every year, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but those numbers have to line up in a way that
Right.
is planned out, and that is all about like the system of making this as organized. Here, you get like we take 1 kid from this high school every year, and I think there are some high schools where they might get that. That's also why if you go to a mega feeder, as it or a feeder, you are pretty much competing against students at your own high school.
Mhm.
Like it's not much you can do about it, and it is kind of like I don't like to bring it up, but yeah, like I you are because they're taking 1/6 students from their school or what have you. Well, like that means you're competing with them directly.
Yeah.
So that brings what else do I have anything put here? Yeah, and it's mostly more East Coast prep schools here, as well as California schools. It's basically just a lower level of the ones above it. I would still be relatively excited to work with a student from this school. It's also somewhat rare. I'm not entirely sure why, but I just it also the line gets a little bit thin of like when you kind of pass into like what I talk about now, which is mini feeders. And this is where Jonathan's school comes in. I believe it was like 600 something. Charlie can pop up his while we're doing it. But essentially, this is, I would say, the surprising majority, like a vast majority of my students come from mini feeders, as I call them. And that's where Jonathan came from. And I'm not entirely sure why this is, but this is basically like, this is your generic good high school. This is the average high school you're going to if you are not going to some super elite one. You're not going to the best high school in your country. It's not the one that people know in your state, if you will. It's also if you live in a non-coastal area like you do, you live in Arizona, it's generally like the best one in your area. Like, what are you gonna do? That's another thing is that the feeder system heavily favors students who live on the East Coast in particular, but also somewhat California because that's where the feeder high schools are. There just aren't that many feeders in those 2 states because, well, the schools don't have that connection. Like, they don't really want 9 kids from Idaho, so it's not a big deal. But so that's probably why I get so many because I get students from all around the country, and and maybe I get a large number of students that aren't from the East Coast and they aren't from California. They're from Michigan often, or Texas, or Illinois. And I think often because their high school's not a feeder, they don't have the same like exposure to like the college admissions craziness that's like a coastal student might have at these schools, and they might be more interested in finding a random man they found on YouTube and check them out at collegeandmattie.com, like for the 2025
And
season. Yeah.
also, like, the resources at those high schools, they aren't gonna have, like, counselors that help with college admissions and things like that.
Yeah, it's gonna vary. It's gonna vary. Like these are not bad schools. You know, like, I don't know your son's high school, but I imagine it was a nice school. Like you, it's. We'll get into the other thousands of schools. Like these are generally respectable schools, and generally students I work with come from pretty well off families that are able to send their like to whatever the good high school is in their area. That's where they go. This one's where it gets a little bit more complicated because you'll see here as we're kind of in just looking at random schools. In, for example, 460. What's the first? Yeah, there's a lot of ties here. 461, then the tie. Okay, so the first 536 school I can use, for example, is the Academy for Math, Science, and Engineering in Rockaway, New Jersey. And this school, between over a 5-year period, sent 5 students to Princeton, 2 to MIT, and 0 to Harvard. Makes it a crappy example. Let's try the next one. The Academy of the Holy Angels in Damaris, New Jersey. Yeah, they sent 3 to Harvard, 3 to Princeton, and 1 to MIT. So that's basically half the time. Every other year, they sent 1 to Harvard. They sent 1 to Princeton, and 1 to MIT. And that's why these are many figures. Like, they're still pretty decent. But what happened the years they didn't? That's weird. You know, like you'll find real consistency higher above. Well, this is where it breaks down into what I think is more common in college admissions. It might sound more familiar to students, is that instead of competing against students at your own school, you are competing against, yes, technically your own school, but also students at other schools kind of in your pack of schools. I often half a joke, it's the schools you compete against in sports, because that makes the most sense to me. Like, I don't know, every school's going to be different and it might just pick their own. But if I ran a school, I'd be like, well, you know, these 8 schools are already in an athletic conference. They're running against each other to play sports. Those 8 schools, they're all in a giant pot, essentially. And it could, like, when you're a mini feeder, it's Princeton takes 1, 2, 3 students every year from these 8 high schools.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yes, and that explains why there's so much tea leaf reading at these schools. People are like, "Oh, no one got in last year. It's because they hate us." No, that doesn't happen. It is because there's incredible variance in this process because you don't know the other 7 schools. You have no idea who any of them are, what their strengths are, what their applicant are, and that's why schools can go 5 or 6 years never having a single student get into a Princeton from there and think they're cursed, and then get 2, and then 3, and then 1, then 3, then 0, because it's just dice rolls of the overall application pool that's pretty massive, honestly. 8 schools all applying to Princeton is a large number of students. And that's why students, I guess you're only technically competing against students at your own high school in this case. Like it's really not worth worrying about because you are 1/8 of a much, I'd say it's about 8 schools, usually 8 to 10 maybe. It's a much bigger pool to compete against. And there's nothing you can do about it. Like, you're not going to know who these people are. You shouldn't bother trying. It's like, and I'm very familiar with this range because this is just what I tend to work with. And I think it's just because if you're not like insane playing the game or signing up for $40,000 preschool or whatever, you tend to end up, if you live I would say a fairly standard, like well-off American life, you tend to end up in a lot of high schools like this, especially if you're like that's the nature of them.
Right.
And then we lead to around like that goes to around 1,200, and like you could tell here, like the feederdom of them gets weaker as you keep going down, obviously. And it's a difference between Harvard accepts 3 students from these 8 schools every year, and Harvard accepts 1 student from these 8 schools every year. That's kind of what you get at the bottom. I get, I have gotten a lot, I mean a lot of students into a lot of schools, including Harvard, Princeton, and MIT from these very specific schools. So I do not panic when I see this. Like this is about as like comfortable meat and potatoes as I get. And then we get to the final part, which are at-large bids, as I call them. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So around 1,200, and you have to go down for a while because there's a lot of, well, obviously, about 1,200 times, you end up at the, oh, I'm just going forever to get to 1,200. Eventually, you reach a point where, well, over a 5-year period, on average, no one was getting in to the median, I suppose. Like, yeah, you get to around 1,200, and suddenly you're at 3 over a 5. Yeah, I would say here's Ram schools at 1,240 over a 5-year period. 3 students got into Harvard here, 0 Princeton, 0 MIT, 1 Harvard, 2 Princeton, etc. And it's obviously going to get very messy as you keep going down the pyramid of like what's actually going on because there's so many schools tied. But I would say as soon as you're getting to like, well, yeah, you're into 3. Well, that means on average you're not getting anyone in. Yeah, at 1,700 you get to 2. If you know the Arizona School for the Arts, Michelle, hadn't done
It
great.
doesn't look like
It's
it.
been a
No.
rough, it's been a rough half decade. And I tend not to get in any students from this range because, well, this tends to not be the most like excellent schools in America. Often the families I work with would prefer to go to a different school that is perhaps a bit more expensive or difficult to get into, for high school. And this list starts at 1,200, whatever, it goes down into the thousands. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of high schools, and you are an at-large bid, as I call them, insofar as there is no structure in place for you to be accepted into these schools. Like you don't, there is no like, well, we take X, we take one of X. Like you're not gonna be, it's like you are basically just in a giant pot. And quite honestly, I believe this is where a lot of like kind of lower income or underrepresented minority students tend to come from. They definitely have a better shot, if only because they are still being scouted for. I have gotten students into elite schools from this range. It is not a death sentence. I don't want students to think that. However, it is a more difficult and complicated process. One that honestly I am not terribly knowledgeable about, like just how hard it is or what happens, because I haven't had a ton of opportunity. What I have had is so that's the one is like, yeah, if you search your school, but what I found was students be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like this isn't the school. It says it's a Harvard. It's like that does not mean it's a death sentence. Like students still get in. It is simply that you are playing a more difficult game and probably need to have an application that gives a reason why they pull it off the pile, because they probably still will check it out. But I don't know, because things get hectic and like they have their process built, and this is kind of outclassed. That's why also homeschoolers fall into this group. Like I think homeschooling is not a great idea if you want to get into a top university, because similarly you lack same thing as like schools that all these schools have no connections to these universities. Like the richest office doesn't know them. They have no pre-vetting. Like often the money's not going to work out. And like for other reasons, they want feeders. Like there's not a lot of incentive to take a bunch of students from these schools. It's probably going to be a more difficult process for the university. Homeschooling has the same problem. Like there's no vetting. They don't trust the grades. And then I found this to be, your schools is new, essentially, especially if it's new and somewhat off the wall. So there's a lot of schools that I think they're a little bit less common now. They're definitely popping up in the like 5 years ago. Kind of like new style of almost online learning opportunities. I have mixed opinions about those. I think they're kind of neat for students. I think they make sense for certain students that traditional high school doesn't work for. However, I don't think they work very well for college admissions, because those connections haven't been built yet, and I don't know if they will. And I don't know if the universities. A lot of it's just about like making this easy for the schools. They don't understand your high school or don't trust it. Like that's going to cause issues as well. And okay, so takeaways. Pretty cool website. Yeah, I got heated. I love this website.
It is cool.
Like you can get
Yeah.
lost just looking at stuff. The fact that takeaways. One is feeders are good. Like if you want to get into elite university, as one word. More specifically, this advice doesn't come up. It was unbelievably hot in the streets a decade, 15 years ago. Michelle, do not move to some middle of nowhere state and go to some school that no one's ever heard of, because you think
Oh my gosh, yes, okay.
like if you want to go to Princeton, you should go to Princeton High School, which sends 94 students a year to Princeton, or excuse me, 94 every 5 years.
You gotta play the long game and go to Princeton preschool.
It's the short game. Like they said 18 a year to Princeton. Yeah, you play the long game and go to Princeton Prep. Yeah, Princeton
Right.
Yeah, yeah. A little baby, it's a little baby tiger, a little baby tiger. I want to make an emblem now, little baby tiger. Uh, it's adorable. Yeah, like that's the game. Do not ever let anyone tell you that like, yeah, it's actually harder if you go to these schools. Like, yeah, it's more competitive, definitely more competitive. Like, there's a lot. You also need to get all A's and have a good application. It's not easy to get into Princeton from Princeton High, but they do accept 19 students on average. So if you sort of it's a lot easier to be in the best, like the top 19 students applying in your high school than it is to be the top like three or four in your state. It's madness, and I'm glad the advice has gone the way of the dodo. Like people don't say it anymore, but I swear, like you can go find it from old stuff. It's like move to Oklahoma and
I
like
do remember reading things like that, yeah. They need the one student from, like, Oklahoma or something.
yeah, and you can search by state, and what you'll find is most states have like basically a mini feeder, or like locates a low end feeder, like 400 to 600 range. There'll be 1 to 2 of them, maybe even in like school states you think would have like no high school in particular. What that means to you.
Right.
Yeah, like that still leads to, yeah, that's basically the game. Is like you may even find that they're picking from one school, or there's like there's like 8 schools and they're letting in X students from them. Like that's kind of how it works. Is it's all about being at the top level. Is each level is better than the one below it. It's much better to be at a mini feeder than an at large bid. It's much better to be at a feeder than a mini feeder. It is way better to be at a mega feeder than a normal feeder. Um, yeah, and if you students students on the East Coast and specific California schools, like affluent basically NorCal and SoCal regions, do get, I think, a pretty notable advantage. I do believe the students that have the biggest disadvantage that probably isn't fair are students from, I would say, affluent, probably fast rising states that are not on the coast.
Mm,
So,
mhm.
uh, I think Texas does pretty well for their own merits, by the way. So, like, we can probably include Texas just because it's such a
Right.
big, it's like so well connected. But like Colorado is the one that comes to mind. I had a student from Colorado once, and she was, I believe, the only student from Colorado accepted into Yale that year because it's schools where the competition's there. There are definitely affluent high schools and high achieving high schools in Colorado, and students who are gunning for these top schools. But that same feederdom connection is either new or simply not like. Why would Harvard care about Colorado more than any other state? Like there's a reason Colorado likes students or Harvard likes students from the Northeast. You know, it makes sense to them. They can get students that are close to their. It's just whatever reasons you could think of. And California just has the connections. But so like Colorado, Michigan to some extent, except like yeah, Michigan feeds into Michigan, but like outside of that, uh, yeah, you know, it's a lot of honestly, it's a lot of states that matter in elections, like Florida, Michigan,
Wow,
Pennsylvania. No,
sounds so familiar.
yeah, it's no, it's not. But yeah, it's there's a lot, and have fun with it. You can search by state on this thing, and like you can get lost in the data just like I have. But it's mostly, I guess, there's not much you could do about it. Don't move. Like
I was gonna say, like, what if you're in high school, you're just finding this out, and you're like, what do I do now? Do I still have a chance, like, to get into these
there's not much
yeah.
can you do. I have guided students who are in middle school into like if your offers comes up, yes, there are certain high schools I think are going to give you a better shot than others. If you don't like, try not to worry about it too much. Know for a fact that the vast majority of my students come from mini feeders. I would say 70% or so. 10% are from mega feeders, another 10% from feeders, and then 10% at large. And I wish my at large my data set for the all four are well, all three are pretty good, honestly. But like for the fourth one at large, it's a pretty limited data set. But I have gotten students in the most elite schools in the world, from different walks of life and different backgrounds, in a way that I would take it on. You know, like I would let them know that it's going to be more challenging, and I might temper expectations. So it's just in the same way that I kind of booster my expectations when they come from these more elite schools and actively get excited and clap when they go to a feeder when I see their website for 'em.
Right.
Um, but don't panic, you know, keep doing it, and I guess understand what the game is. I worry the mega feeder and feeder students be like, "Oh, no, I am confused." Like, "Yeah, you are." The mini feeders, don't worry about it. I don't know, like, that's it's I try to be honest about these things almost to a fault, but that is how I see it. Okay, thank you, Michelle, I got excited. This is a fun one.
Thank you, that was fun. That was super eye-opening.
Yes, I encourage you to dig into this website, and please ask questions about this one. If there's anything about this website or my feederdom stuff, I'd love to do a follow-up because there's a million things you can talk about once you get on this website. It's the best website called. Was that a stone? I figured out the term. We're done for today. Okay, see you next time, Michelle. Your episode. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thank you for watching College with Mattie. For more information or a coaching session with Mattie, visit collegewithmattie.com. You can follow College with Mattie on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Tune in next week for more episodes, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.